familiar with the term a gotcha question? A gotcha question? You usually hear this term at this time of year, especially when there's a presidential election coming. Did anyone know there was an election coming? I mean, talk about having to be buried beneath a rock, and not knowing what's going on. In other words, a gotcha question is a question that the questioner asks really with very little intention of getting at an answer, but rather holding up the person that they ask the question to ridicule. For example, just take an example that we're all familiar with. If a reporter from, say, MSNBC, CNN, or most of the major networks today, asked President Trump this question. President Trump, why did you let over 200,000 Americans die? The implication of this question, of course, is that President Trump, or any president, has power of life and death over disease. And it also implies that if they have this power, they have not exercised it because they do not care about all those people that died. Now it works both ways. Mr. Biden, Vice President Biden, if he is questioned by, say, a reporter from Fox or one of the conservative radio outlets, they might ask him, Mr. Biden, you were in a position of power for over 40 years as a senator and as Vice President of the United States. If that's so, why didn't you fix all the problems that happened then and that you see so clearly today? Now, granted, there is some element of legitimacy to both of those questions, grant you. But there is an underlying intent, oftentimes, by the questioner, again, not to get at the truth so much as to get the person who is trying to answer the question into trouble. And usually they frame it so that there's no way you're going to satisfy all the people. Now, political candidates always face these kinds of issues all the time. Every election we have ever seen, there's been situations like that. And it probably should be some solace to these candidates because they're in very good company. Indeed, they are in the best of company. Because in today's lesson from St. Matthew's Gospel, we have no one less than the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, come down amongst us as Jesus the Son, who is put in the same position, isn't he? Matthew makes it clear that when Jesus was questioned by the Pharisees, the intention was not to get at the truth, but rather to get Jesus into hot water. His questioners are named as two groups of people. The one group we're very familiar with. They're called the Pharisees. And these are the guys They're lay people, they're not priests, but they are nevertheless the leaders of Israel because many of them sit on the Sanhedrin, the governing council of Israel. And they are people who are very, very familiar with the law, seek to practice it themselves, but also are very good at judging others as being less than themselves. We know the Pharisees. We know the Pharisees. But there's another group mentioned, and that is the Herodians. The Herodians. And you might guess, from that big long name, you break it into little bits, that the one thing that jumps out at you is this name Herod. We know Herod was the Roman puppet king of Galilee. He appears many times in the scriptures. The Herodians were people that oftentimes were priests, and they were people that were very comfortable with new ideas that were coming into Judaism from the Greco-Roman world. So you had two groups of people, the Pharisees on the one hand and the Herodians on the other, who ordinarily didn't talk to each other because they disliked each other so much that they just couldn't abide them being in the same household with them. Sound familiar? And yet, they got together because they faced a common enemy, Jesus, who was threatening their position of power and their interpretation of the law, whatever that might be. And so they decide to gang up on Jesus, the two of them. And they have a question for Jesus that, as I say, is sure to get them into trouble. But they're very crafty indeed. Because how do they begin the questioning? This teacher. They call him rabbi. That's nice. They recognize that he's the teacher of Israel. Isn't that nice? Teacher, we know that you are sincere. You tell it like it is. And you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. And you show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. See what they're doing here? They're buttering him up. They're laying all these compliments on him. Why? Because they think by doing this, he'll let down his guard and he'll think, oh, these people like me. They're on my side. And then, as soon as he gets there, it's like the cheese in the trap. They got him. Because now they come with the zinger of a question. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Sounds simple enough, right? But is it really? In this situation, Jesus is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. He's going to divide people dramatically on the basis of his answer. What's the problem? The problem is this. If he says it's right to pay the tax to the emperor, then all those people that regard the emperor and the Romans as conquerors, as invaders, as occupiers, as suppressors of their freedom and their country, because the tax goes to pay for the Roman army, among other things, that's keeping them down. does it also indicate an unholiness? Because on these coins, there is the head of the emperor with a Latin inscription, Imperator Rex, Emperor, King, his name. And there might also be the title God. Because any of you that know Roman history know that the Romans were very quick to label their emperors as gods and to mandate that everyone worship them as a sign of loyalty to the state. So, Jesus is supposed to endorse that. On the other hand, if he says, don't pay the tax, well, I think we can all figure out what's going to happen there, right? They didn't have the IRS back then, but they didn't need the IRS back then. They had thugs, and they had an army. And if you led something that would get at the very heart of Roman power, which was the ability to pay troops, then you would be arrested, thrown into some prison hole if you were lucky, and then perhaps you could even get crucified or whatever. Didn't matter. You were an enemy of the state. So what is Jesus going to do? What's he going to do? Well, Jesus is not just Joe Blow. They have trouble learning that, right? They're always stepping into something. Jesus understands their motives, what's going on inside, what prompts them to do this, so he's not going to play the little game. He calls them hypocrites, mask wearers. I don't mean COVID mask wearers. And he says, show me this coin that is used to pay the tax. Now, again, there were 3 taxes that Israelites had to pay to the Roman authorities. First tax was a ground tax. If you were a farmer and you raised grain, you had to pay 1/10 of the crops, either in kind or in money, to the Romans. If you had an olive grove and you had olive oil, you had to give 1/5 of that, or its monetary equivalent, to the Romans. That was one tax. Second tax was an income tax. What do you think the rate was? Residents of 2020. 1%. 1%. Wouldn't that be wonderful? 1% income tax. But nevertheless, it was going to a conquering enemy. Remember that. Finally, there was something called a poll tax, an individual tax levied on all citizens who were between the age of teenager and 65 years old, men and women. And this was 1 denarius coin. 1 denarius coin. And a denarius, remember, is what an ordinary working person would earn in a day. Jesus says, show me the coin that you're talking about to pay this tax. And he holds it up and he says, well, whose image and title do you see on this coin? And they say, the emperor's. Jesus then says to them, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. They're amazed. Somehow he has answered the question without getting into trouble. And they go away mad. Oh, they'll be back. Don't worry about that. They'll be back. But for now, they're confounded. What about us who have heard Jesus say this thing? Are we to conclude just that Jesus won the contest, if that's what it was, and has eluded being captured, so he didn't really answer the question? Or are there other possibilities? Well, one of the possibilities probably is to say, okay, Jesus is saying, give money to the emperor because it's his, and give other things to God. Almost as if creation and we are divided equally between what belongs to the world and what belongs to the church. You know? But think about that a minute. Think about that a minute. Does that mean then that Caesar, the government, others, human beings, own us Monday through Friday or Saturday, and God owns us just on Sunday? Does that mean that God doesn't have any care or any concern about what happens to the public, political side of who we are as citizens of both the kingdom of God and of man? What did Jesus really say? He said, give to God the things that are God's. Well, what are these things that belong to God? If an image on a coin seems to indicate ownership of that coin, with the case of an emperor, what about us? What does Genesis say? We are created in the image of the emperor?
Of God.
God. God. We are created in the image of God. So, apparently, we, all of us, belong to God. We are not owners of ourselves or of creation, but rather we are stewards, those who have been entrusted with the care of ourselves, our neighbor, and creation. To follow God's agenda, not Caesar's. Now, no one is arguing that government doesn't have a place in our lives. Right? Government can be good. It can be necessary. It can do things that we cannot as individuals or as small groups do for one another. Provide all those essentials for living a collective life in the year of our Lord 2020. Complicated business. We need a government. We need a good government. But we need to remember that government and God are not equal. God is the king, the only king. And government is only one of those institutions through which God rules his world. Through us. Where we as human beings get in trouble is when we forget that. And we think that government and God are equal. Or perhaps government's even greater than God. So it is throughout long human history that human beings have invested themselves with godlike quality and taken the place, or tried to take the place, that only belongs to God. And I don't care whether you're a left-wing person or a right-wing person. We have abundant examples of people doing that very thing, don't we? I mean, on the one side, you've got a Mao Zedong and a Lenin and all of that crowd. On the other side, you have Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and people like that. You know, it's not a partisan thing, folks. But it's a danger that we all face. And it seems to me that God is calling all of us at this time in history and all times in history to put him first and to look for political leaders that will also do likewise. Now, I grant you, it's not an easy thing. God, this may surprise folks, God is not a Republican. God is not a Democrat. There are good Republicans, good Democrats. There are Democrats that do bad things. There are Republicans that do bad things. But we are all called to be good citizens, and that means being good servants of the Lord who is Lord of all. The job of the church is to lay forth principles by which we can try to judge among the various competing interests that would rule us through government. And we all know what those general principles are. How we attain them may be matters of dispute, and why there are differing political parties and different opinions of things. Perfectly all right. But today, Jesus reminds us that we are blessed to bear the image not of the world, but rather of God. And we are all called to the highest of callings, which is to be good caretakers of this world that God has given us. As individuals, as voters, as people like Pastor Scott, who run for political office. Perfectly appropriate for the Christian. Let us remember that. And let us take the advice of a hymn that is one of my favorites, very similar to the hymn that we're just going to sing very shortly, or listen to very shortly. And you all know this hymn. It sounds like a commentary on today's lesson. We give thee but thine own, whate'er the gift may be. All that we have is thine alone. A trust, O Lord, from thee. What a difference if politicians and citizens would regard their lives as a sacred trust, rather than a vehicle only of power. Let us pray for our country, our world, and one another, that we might truly be faithful servants of our God and King. Jesus